The Big Bang Theory was invented by a Catholic priest.
State that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started. Wait, the earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, Neanderthals developed tools, we built a wall. We built the pyramids, math, science, history, unraveling the mystery that all started with a Big Bang. Hey!
Catholic priest. There was a lot of science from the time of Galileo up until the end of the 19th century, and nobody ever thought anything about that would be unusual. If you look into the science books of the 18th century, who are the people doing science? What does it take to be able to be a scientist? You have to have an education. You've got to have an interest in doing it. You've got to have the free time to do it. There was either noblemen, medical doctors, or clergymen. And in fact, most of science is just keeping records. And what do you call keeping records? It's clerical work, right? Why is it called clerical work? Because originally it was done by clerics. When you're a parish priest, you know how to keep records. And keeping records is 50% of doing science. And so science was done by the clergy. It's only in the politics of the end of the 19th century that people start inventing this. Oh, look at Galileo, he was a martyr to science. Well, no, he wasn't. Oh, look at all the other ideas that somehow the church was anti-science come up at this time. And to counter that, Pope Leo XIII establishes an actual national observatory. He also liked the idea that the Vatican city-state, which at that time was just the area around St. Peter's, nonetheless was an independent country. He establishes a Vatican observatory so that everyone can see that the church supports science. And in this image here, if you can see it, there's the coat of arms of Pope Leo XIII, which by coincidence has a comet in it, which I always thought was a nice coincidence. Next slide. One of the things they do is they join an international group that are going to photograph the sky. The sky is so big that one observatory alone can't photograph the entire thing, but they have 18 observatories with identical telescopes, all of them national observatories. The Vatican's one of them. They photograph the sky, and then they have to measure the dots of starlight on every photographic plate, measure their position, and come up with an atlas. You need a computer to do that. In fact, the Vatican had 4 computers. These nuns who worked at the Sisters of the Child Mary, and they were the ones who did the detailed measurements that came up with the original atlas of the sky. We now have a telescope under construction that will repeat what this survey did over a period of 50 years. We now have a telescope that will do it 3 times a week. By measuring the star positions and see how they move and see how the stars vary, you actually can get a heck of a lot of fascinating science. The old plates, meanwhile, we are scanning and digitizing so that we can compare where the stars were in 1890 with where we see them today. In the 1930s, as you saw, the Vatican and Italy came to an agreement, and the old papal territory up by Castel Gandolfo was given back to the Vatican. And so this palace, which had been built by Maffeo Barberini, Pope Urban VIII, the Pope who Galileo and he got mad at each other, was turned into an astronomical observatory. And this is where I lived for the first 15 years that I was at the Vatican Observatory. In the next slide, you can see the top floor. That's where the offices of the observatory was. The next slide, that was my particular office, where that arrow is in the top floor. The next slide, that's the bedroom of the Pope when he's in town. So you're looking at the one guy who used to be above the Pope in the Catholic Church. However, our work and the papal work during the summer got so involved that we finally moved to wonderful quarters in the gardens I don't have pictures of. And we moved out there in 2009. We'd never moved back. It's great to think that you're living in a palace. That building was not built with indoor plumbing or central heating or the internet in mind. It's a whole lot nicer where we are now. But the light pollution also made it impossible to do astronomy there, and that's why we have this telescope, as you saw in the film, in Mount Graham. Next. It's located out there in essentially the middle of nowhere. And I could talk forever about, go back one, just that beautiful view of the mountaintop itself. This is important to remember. Astronomy is very detailed, and it's very mathematical, and it's very tedious at times, but it's also beautiful. And it puts you in beautiful places to look at beautiful things. The telescope itself is a marvelous machine, and again, I could talk for hours about that, but I won't. What I will mention is that we have astronomy that not only uses the telescope, but also does theory. This was a gathering of Nobel Prize winners and other experts in the field of cosmology in a meeting that was held a year ago in May in honor of Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest who was not a Jesuit, he was a diocesan. It is possible to be smart and not be a Jesuit. Georges Lemaitre had 2 doctorates, one from Louvain, one from MIT, and he was the kind of mathematician who could read mathematics the way you might be able to read poetry. And in the 1920s, he was reading Einstein's theory of general relativity and what it said about the universe, and he said, you know, in these equations is the realization that the universe could be expanding. And if the universe is expanding, we ought to be able to observe it. And in fact, they had observed it by then, though they didn't have the Hubble law yet. And if the universe is expanding now, I can envision a cosmology where it was once much smaller. And he referred to this beginning point as the primeval atom. And an Englishman who hated the idea that the universe might have a beginning because he thought it smacked too much of Genesis, made fun of it and called it the Big Bang Theory.
Excuse me. All right, move on. Nothing to see here. Please disperse. Nothing to see here, please.